Alright, you guys, Miss Nelson here. If you've made it to this lecture, then that means you are ready to start taking some notes in your Elements of Fiction travel guide, so make sure you have it up in front of you. I will be showing you what you need to write. Those things will be in red, and then those underlined questions will be on your own. We'll talk about that more here in a bit. But make sure your name is on your travel guide, and when you are ready, you can press continue. Awesome. So before we start diving into the elements of fiction, I want you to first understand the main concepts here. So there are 7 main elements of fiction, and those are the elements that we are going to be going over today. So the first one is inference, the second is context clues, the third is tone and mood, the fourth is theme, fifth element is plot, followed by conflict, and then figurative language. Some of these are probably familiar to you. Some of them may be new. And so we're going to be covering all of these in this lecture. So the goal is that by the end of this lecture, you're a pro in all 7 of these elements. Go ahead and answer once you've filled in the red text on your copy, right? And you are writing these by hand on your copy. When you are finished writing in all 7 of these elements of fiction, then you can go ahead and answer these 3 underlined questions. The first one is, why do the elements of fiction matter, right? Why do you think that they matter? There's no right or wrong answers here. I'm just curious why you think these elements of fiction matter. Second, which element of fiction do you know the most about? Which one is familiar to you? And then lastly, which one are you most curious to learn more about? So once you've filled in all 7 elements of fiction and you've answered all 3 of these underlined questions, you can go ahead and continue the lecture. Awesome. So our first element of fiction is inferencing. So what is inferencing? Inferencing is something that good readers do when a writer intentionally leaves out certain details of a story to make it more dramatic or humorous. When you inference, you draw conclusions based on the information that's given to you. So it's you using your brain, looking at the information in front of you, and then coming up with those conclusions. What are 3 ways good readers inference? 3 ways that good readers inference is by using 1, what you read about the characters and the plot details, so using the information that's presented to you. 2, using your common sense, right? There may be some things that you just know and you're able to pick up on. Or 3, your own experience, right? We all have collected all sorts of experiences during our lifetimes, so it's totally fair to use those experiences to come up with good references and inferences. So what does the image on the right tell you, and how do you know? This is an answer that you are answering on your own, but check out this image on the right, and what can we gather? What conclusions can we draw from this image over here on the right-hand side? Don't forget to fill in the red text on these 2 parts, and when you are finished filling out everything on the page, go ahead and continue the lecture. The next element of fiction that we're talking about is context clues. So what is a context clue used for? Well, inferences help us figure out what's going on in the story that may not necessarily is being said. But context clues help us figure out the smaller pieces, right? The unknown words and phrases that we need to understand in order to draw those references. So what are 4 ways to use context clues? Well, first off, you can use examples as part of your context clues. So for example, Suzanne had many ailments, including a rash, allergies, and a chronic headache. You may not know this word ailments, but you can figure out from the examples it gives us, rash, allergies, and chronic headache, that ailments probably have to do with not feeling well, right? Being unhealthy or having health problems. So even though you may not know the word ailments, by using these examples, you can start to figure out what it means. Another way we can use context clues is through synonyms. Synonyms are words that have the same meaning. So in this example, the young girl was very aloof. Aloof is our word here that we don't know, but it gives us many synonyms. She always seems sociable, unapproachable, and uninterested. So we, using our brains, can understand that aloof also means unsociable, also means unapproachable, and also means uninterested. Next up, using antonyms. We thought that athletes would be famished after their game, but they were not hungry at all. If we're trying to figure out this word famished, we can use antonyms, which are words that mean the opposite of what we're trying to figure out in order to find meaning. So if we don't know what the word famished means, but we understand that they were not hungry at all, then we can understand that famished may have something to do with hunger. Lastly, we can use general meaning in order to figure out context clues. So it took 2 days for the volunteers to extricate the little girl from the bottom of the well. If we don't know what the word extricate means here, we can use our understanding that little girls typically aren't at the bottom of wells, and if volunteers are helping the little girl at the bottom of the well, then they're probably helping to get her out. So we can assume that extricate might mean might be along the lines of getting out. Okay, so these are 4 ways that we can use our context clues to figure out unknown words and phrases. Make sure you have those red parts filled in. When you are finished filling in the red parts, then you can answer the underlined question, which is choose 3 words in the story 7th grade that you used context clues to determine the meaning of. So find 3 words in 7th grade that you didn't at first know, and then tell me the ways that you figured out what they meant. Once you have that page filled in, you can go ahead and continue the lecture. Next on our list for the elements of fiction is tone and mood. Tone and mood are often confused for being the same thing, but they're in fact very different. So what is the difference between tone and mood? Tone is the author's attitude towards the audience, the subject, or the character, versus mood is the feeling that the reader gets from a story. So tone is with the author, but mood is with the reader. So how do we find tone? If tone is something that the author does, how can we recognize it? Tone is shown through the dialogue or the characters talking, and description, which is the author's word choice and their diction. Versus mood is shown through setting and atmosphere. So that's what's going on, what's happening, when's it happening, and how is it making us as the reader feel. I like to think of the mood as the vibes. So using this example on the right hand side, I'll read through it, and then I'm curious, what do you think the tone and the mood are? So he approached the task with sheer determination. He had studied his plans carefully, spent hours preparing, and was sure of his approach. The hours he spent practicing were grueling and exhausting, but he was ready. This was the year he would finally win the pie eating contest at school. So for example, we could say that the tone, right, the author's attitude towards the audience is very confident. This person is confident, and they're writing in a confident way that they're going to be eating the pie eating contest at school. Versus our mood of reading this could be that we're excited or motivated or impressed with what's going to be happening in this short little example story. So if you have a different tone or a different mood, go ahead and fill those in, and then tell me, how do you know those things? If you think the tone is confident, what parts of the story tell you that it's a confident tone? If you think the mood is impressed, tell me what or how you know that the mood is impressed. Once you've filled in those red pieces and answered the underlined questions, you can continue the lecture. Up next, we're talking about theme. Theme is a really big thing that we're going to be talking about in English class and for the rest of your English career, so it's important that we understand it. What is theme? So theme is the point or the underlying meaning of a literary work. It can be stated directly or it can be stated indirectly as well. Sometimes we think of themes as the lesson or the moral of the story, but we're more so looking at what the author is trying to get after here. Now, what is not a theme? Theme is not one word like love or family or be kind. You may have been told in the past that those words are themes, but in secondary school, so in middle school and high school, we refer to those words as motifs. They can be building blocks for your theme, but they themselves are not a theme. Some examples of theme include these 3. The first one is, even when faced with tremendous evil, people can still be good. Second is, we all have to grow up sometime. And then lastly, you may not know people as well as you think you do. All of these could be found in a piece of literature that's telling us the underlying meaning of that work, but none of them are just one word. They're all complete sentences that tell us that meaning. Awesome. Over here on the side, you can see what we call the theme iceberg. Up at the top, we have plot, which we'll be talking about here in a moment, and then what's happening in the story. But underneath the surface that we don't necessarily see, unless we were to go underwater, right, is the theme. The theme, as it says, drives both plot and story from beneath the surface. It's that underlying meaning. Once you have those red pieces filled in, you can go ahead and continue the lecture. Alright, we got a sneak peek of this last literary element on the previous slide, but we're talking about plot now. So what is plot? Plot is the main events of a story, right? A plot diagram is what's over here on the right. We like to call it a story mountain, but it's the same thing. It is just a way for us to visualize and map out the plot of a story. So if you need to turn your paper to be able to see these things over on the right-hand side, feel free to do so. A lot of this is probably review for you. But at the base of the story mountain, we have the background. The background is also called the exposition, but this is the time that we are introduced to the characters and the setting and what's going on in their world. The second thing that we see is what's called the rising action. So this starts to, we start to see some events happening, right? We may start to see some conflict unfold. Some characters are butting heads. There's a problem at hand. That's all a part of the rising action. When this all builds up to a point, that's called the climax. This is where the problem reaches a high point. Over here on the left-hand side, you can see I have the question, how do you determine the climax? And the climax is the highest point of tension in a storyline. The climax of a story is intense. It's often surprising. It answers some sort of question we may have been wondering, and it happens in the middle-ish of a story, at least past the halfway point. So the climax is that most intense part of our story. After the climax, we have falling action. This is when the characters work to solve the problem or the conflict. They may be responding to the climax or coming out of whatever that big intense moment was. And then lastly, we have the resolution. This is how the story ends up, right? How it ends, how the loose ends get tied back together, and how we, the reader, are left. Once you have those green, oh my gosh, red notes filled in, you can go ahead and continue the lecture. Awesome. So on this next slide, we have a plot diagram for 7th grade by Gary Soto. So what I would like to see is you fill in this plot diagram for what you think those events are for 7th grade, the story that we read earlier this week or last week, okay? So that background piece, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution, you can just write right in those boxes and press the continue button when you are finished. Our second to last fiction element is conflict. So what is conflict? Conflict is the problem that a character faces in the story. Conflict can be internal, meaning it's a problem happening within themselves, or it can be external, meaning that there's a force outside of the character that creates this struggle. The 7 types of conflict are man versus man nature, man versus society, man versus technology. Oh, I have man versus society twice. Man versus supernatural and man versus self. So I want you to put a star next to the internal conflicts, next to the types of conflict that you think are internal. So out of these 7, which ones of these do you think the character is facing a problem within themselves? Then lastly, does each story have only one conflict? Nope, a story can have multiple types of conflict. And then I have 2 questions for you. What do you think is the main conflict in 7th grade, and how do you know? And then what are the conflicts in your favorite story? This could be a movie, an anime, a TV show, maybe a YouTube docuseries that you've been following, maybe a book that you're reading. I'm curious, what conflicts do you see in the stories that you're reading? So once you have these red pieces of text filled in, you've put those stars, and you've typed in the word nope, and you've answered these 2 questions, you can go ahead and continue the lecture. All right, this is our final literary or fiction element, and it is figurative language. Figurative language is probably my favorite literary and fiction element, just because it's fun and it's a really great way to write creatively. So what is the difference between literal and figurative language? Literal language is when you say exactly what you mean. You make no comparison and you do not exaggerate or understate the situation. Versus in figurative language, you can get more creative. You don't say exactly what you mean. You do compare, you do exaggerate, and you do understate the situation because you're going about telling something in a more crafty and creative way. So that is the difference between literal and figurative language. People may say literally sometimes. If they're literally saying something, then they're for real saying it. But if they're saying it in a figurative way or figuratively, then they're usually being artful or creative about what they're trying to tell you, but they're not just saying it. Okay, over here on the right, we have this guy who is a figure of speech, and I'm curious if you can recognize 2 forms of figurative language in this image, okay? Some of them you may have heard just a few times, but see if you can recognize 1 or 2. I'll give you one here, right? He has a silver spoon in his mouth. That's something that we say when somebody has grown up very wealthy. We may say they were raised with a silver spoon in their mouth. See if you can recognize 2 more and fill them in this area here. Once you've done so and you've typed in the red text, or you filled in the red text, you're not typing, you can go ahead and continue with the last part of the lecture. Awesome. So we have just 2 slides left. In this part 2 of figurative language, we're talking about all the figurative devices. These figurative devices can be broken into the acronym shampoo. So on your page, you see shampoo. You need to fill in what each of those letters means. So a simile is when we compare something using like or as. You could say something like, he was as brave as a lion. Okay, that would be an example of a simile. Hyperbole is an exaggeration. We do this one all the time. If I were to say, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. Do I literally mean I will eat a horse? No, but I'm just trying to tell you how hungry I am. Alliteration is the repetition of the same letter or sound. We see these in limericks or tongue twisters a lot. So Sally sells seashells by the seashore would be an example of alliteration. Next we have metaphor. Metaphor is probably the toughest just because it's when you're comparing 2 unlike things without using like or as. So if we were to say he was an animal on the basketball court, he's not literally an animal on the basketball court, but he is so good at basketball that we're saying he's an animal. Personification is when you give human characteristics to things that are not human. I think this one's a lot of fun. Like you could say that your car was breathing heavily, right? If it's having a hard time getting up a hill. Is it literally breathing? No, a car doesn't have lungs, but we're using that to demonstrate how hard the car is working getting up a hill. Onomatopoeia is words that sound like what they mean. So even something like crash or zoom are examples of onomatopoeia. And then lastly, oxymoron, which is a fun one. These are words or phrases in which they are contradictory or opposite what they mean. We're going to be looking at some of these next week, but you're welcome to look up some for your challenge on the right-hand side of this paper, which is to give one example of your own of each element in shampoo. Example would be, you look like $1,000,000. That would be a simile. Try not to use the examples that I just gave you. If you want to look some up on Google, you're more than welcome to do so. Once you have the red text and those 7 shampoo examples filled in, you can continue to the last slide of the lecture. Awesome. So this is the final slide of the lecture where we are talking again about figurative language, but this time I want to know that you can recognize it in our story 7th grade. So see if you can find just 2 examples of figurative language. It can be any of the shampoos, and then tell me how you think that they enhance the story. The last thing that we have over here on the right-hand side is symbolism. Symbolism is a part of the figurative devices, but I wanted to talk about it separately because it's a bit more complicated. The definition for symbolism, which, by the way, this should be in red text, I'm not sure why it isn't, but you need to fill in this definition, which says when writers use animals, elements, things, places, or colors to represent ideas and concepts. An object used to represent an idea, symbols help you understand the story on a deeper level. So how do you find symbols? Well, you look for things that appear repeatedly. Eventually you guys will read the story The Great Gatsby in high school, and the story always is constantly mentioning some sort of green light, so that is a good indicator for you as an excellent reader that this may be a symbol. Another way that we find symbols is by looking for things that seem connected to a character or event. So if you notice that a character always has on the same pair of shoes when bad things happen to them, then that pair of shoes may be an excellent symbol. And then lastly, the author's description. Sometimes authors will go into lengthy detail about one thing, and if they go into lengthy detail about one thing, it's probably because they want us to notice that one thing. So make sure that you're paying close attention to those because they just might be symbols. A few examples of symbols include different colors, right? We associate red maybe with blood or even with romance. Skulls are a symbol that we usually associate with death. Weather is something that we associate with different things, right? Snow and winter versus spring and rain. Religious objects such as crosses or rosaries. And then different animals, right? The bald eagle is a huge symbol for the United States, and many other animals have symbols as well. So your last thing that you need to fill in for this field guide is what is one example of symbolism in 7th grade. So look back at your 7th grade story, see if you can find a symbol, right? Remember to look for things that appear repeatedly, things that seem connected to a character or event, or the author's description, and see if you can find a symbol in 7th grade. Once you've filled in all the good stuff on this page, you are all done with your note catcher, so be sure to double check, make sure you've got it all there, and then come see me for your stamp. Excellent work, you guys. Way to get through this lecture. Let me know if you have any questions.